Welcome to our channel, where the shadows are long and the stories are even longer. Tonight we're dimming the lights and stepping into the hushed silence of deserted cinemas. Places where the line between fantasy and reality blurs like an old film reel left to decay. We've collected 3 terrifying tales of unexplained lights in these abandoned picture palaces. Stories whispered in hushed tones by those who claim to have seen more than just the flickering images on the screen. Turn off the lights, sit back and prepare to be scared, because what you're about to hear might just keep you from ever sitting in an empty theater again. In the heart of a nameless city stood the once grand Orpheum Theatre, now a husk with velvet seats ripped and faded, its former glory a distant memory, its screen torn and hanging like a shroud, a ghostly reminder of the stories it once showcased. The only company the old theatre kept were the rats, and the memories that echoed in its silence, a silence that seemed almost palpable. It was here that our story began, with Michael, the last projectionist of the Orpheum, a man clinging to a job that no longer existed, yet unable to let go. Michael had seen it all, from the laughter of children at matinees to the tears of couples at late-night romances, each moment etched in his memory. When the Orpheum finally went dark, Michael stayed on, a caretaker of memories in a mausoleum of dreams, a guardian of a bygone era. His nights were spent in the projection booth, the hum of the ancient equipment a comfort in the silence, a link to the past. One night, as Michael sat in his usual perch, the projector sputtered to life, breaking the stillness. He hadn't touched the switch, hadn't even powered on the equipment, yet there it was, running on its own. A chill snaked down his spine, a coldness that seemed to seep into his very bones. He cautiously made his way down the narrow aisle of the projection booth, his eyes fixed on the projector, heart pounding. The light from the lens illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an almost magical scene. Michael's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the projector, fear and curiosity battling within him. It was then that he saw him, a figure standing in the darkness near the screen, an eerie presence. The figure was tall and thin, almost skeletal in its outline, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, a relic from another time. The figure stood perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness, but Michael could feel its gaze burning into him, an intense scrutiny. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, as if held by an unseen force. He could only watch as the figure reached out a hand and touched the screen, a gesture that seemed almost tender. As if on cue, the projector flickered and an image appeared on the screen, a black and white film depicting a bustling city street full of life. Michael recognized it instantly, a film from the Orpheum's opening night, a cherished memory. The figure on the screen moved closer, its face coming into focus, revealing more details. It was a man, his features handsome, his eyes full of life and laughter, a stark contrast to the ghostly figure. The figure in the projection booth turned, as if sensing Michael's gaze, acknowledging his presence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure in the booth vanished, the projector sputtering back into silence, leaving Michael alone once more. Our next tale takes us to the outskirts of a forgotten town, in the skeletal remains of the once grand Rialto Theatre, where a group of friends decided to tempt fate and explore its haunted halls. The Rialto had been closed for decades, its doors shut tight, its marquee a twisted parody of its former grandeur, now broken and forgotten. Locals whispered tales of the theatre being haunted, of spirits that roamed its darkened corridors, of strange lights and sounds emanating from its boarded-up windows, especially at night. There was Jessica, the de facto leader, Mark, the class clown always ready with a joke, and Emily, quiet and observant, always noticing the little things. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows, the group approached the Rialto. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they slipped through a gap in the boarded-up entrance, hearts pounding with anticipation. The air inside the Rialto was thick with dust, particles dancing in the flashlight beams, the smell of mildew and decay overwhelming their senses. Jessica flicked on her flashlight, the click echoing in the silence, its beam cutting through the gloom like a knife. "See? Just an old creepy theater," she said, trying to sound confident. But even as she spoke, a shiver ran down her spine, betraying her true feelings. The eerie atmosphere was getting to her. They made their way down the aisle, the old carpet muffling their footsteps, yet the sound still echoed in the stillness, amplifying their unease. As they reached the front of the theater, they noticed a faint light flickering near the stage. "What's that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark chuckled nervously. "Probably just rats," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. As they got closer, the flickering light grew brighter, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls, revealing its source, a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire above the stage. The bulb swung gently, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance. "There's no power here. How can that light be on?" Jessica muttered, puzzled. Suddenly, the bulb stopped swinging and the light intensified, almost blinding them. The air grew noticeably colder, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. And then, they heard it, a voice, low and mournful, echoing through the empty theater, seeming to emanate from the very walls of the theater. It spoke of betrayal, of a love scorned, of a life tragically cut short, a story of sorrow and regret. Emily, her intuition screaming at her to flee, grabbed Jessica's arm tightly. "We need to leave," she whispered urgently. They turned to run, their flashlights bouncing wildly. But as they made their way up the aisle, the sense of dread growing, they realized the flickering light was following them, almost as if it had a mind of its own. The voice continued its mournful tale, growing louder. They stumbled and ran, their fear lending speed to their flight, hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, they burst through the gap in the boarded-up entrance, gasping for breath, the cold night air a welcome relief. They didn't stop running until they reached the relative safety of the streetlight's glow, its warm light a stark contrast to the theater's cold darkness. As they caught their breath, the reality of what they had just experienced began to sink in. They looked at each other, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock. They didn't need to speak to know that they had all experienced something truly unsettling, something that would stay with them forever. They never returned to the Rialto, the memory of that night etched in their minds, their youthful curiosity replaced by a healthy dose of fear and respect for the unknown, a lesson learned the hard way. Chapter 3, the final screening. For our final tale, we journey to a nameless town in the dilapidated shell of the Grand Cinema, where Edward would experience a night of terror that would haunt him forever. The Grand Cinema had once been a beacon of entertainment, its neon lights a siren song to those seeking escape from their mundane lives. Now its marquee was a canvas of rust and neglect, a shadow of its former glory. Slated for demolition, the Grand Cinema stood as a haunting testament to the ephemeral nature of dreams and the relentless march of time. Edward, a man haunted by a past he couldn't outrun, had heard whispers of the Grand Cinema's final screening, a legend that piqued his curiosity. It was a local legend, a story of a mysterious film reel discovered in the theater's basement, shrouded in dust and forgotten by time. The story went that on the eve of the Grand Cinema's demolition, the theater's last projectionist had screened the film for an audience of one, himself, in a final act of defiance. Intrigued by the macabre tale, Edward arrived at the Grand Cinema on the night of its demolition, determined to uncover the truth. The air around the theater was thick with anticipation and a palpable sense of dread, as if the building itself was aware of its impending fate. Undeterred, Edward slipped through a side door and stepped into the echoing silence of the Grand Cinema's lobby, his heart pounding in his chest. Dust motes danced in the faint moonlight, filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows, creating an eerie, almost magical atmosphere. He made his way down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, each step amplifying his growing sense of unease. As he reached the projection booth, a sense of unease washed over him, a feeling that he was not alone. Taking a deep breath, Edward flicked on the projector, its ancient motor sputtering to life with a groan. The beam of light from the projector flickered to life, and the film began to play, casting an eerie glow in the dark room. The images on the screen were grainy and flickering, the film stock brittle with age, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The film itself was a mystery, a series of disjointed scenes that seemed to tell a story only the brave could decipher. A sense of unease settled over Edward as he watched, his mind racing to make sense of the bizarre images. As the film unspooled, The scenes grew increasingly unsettling, each frame more disturbing than the last. Edward tried to rationalize what he was seeing, but deep down a primal fear began to take root, gnawing at his sanity. And then the lights in the projection booth began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls. Edward turned from the projector, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath quickening. The flickering light from the projector cast long shadows across the projection booth, creating an almost otherworldly scene. He could have sworn he saw movement in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of something not quite human. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a wave of cold air washed over him, sending shivers down his spine. It was then that he heard it, a whisper, soft at first, then growing in intensity, seeming to emanate from the very walls of the projection booth itself, as if the theater was trying to communicate with him. The lights flicker back on, a harsh contrast to the darkness that has permeated your senses. But the echoes of these tales, of phantom projectionists, flickering warnings and final screenings, linger in the silence. Remember, these are just stories, tales spun from the shadows and brought to life by your imagination. Or are they? If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-chilling content. And if you dare, share your own scary cinema experiences in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe and keep the lights on. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness, waiting for its moment to step into the light.